Good day, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Governance and Policy Podcast by the Adam Smith Centre, Singapore's first and only organization promoting pro-market values. The aim of this podcast is educational and to underpin the importance of economics, public policy ideas, and the humanities in general. I'm Colin, and I'll be the host for today's episode. Today, we're joined by Blaise Joseph, who will speak on home-based learning experience in Australia. Blaise Joseph is an Education Research Fellow at the Centre for Independent Studies based in Sydney. The centre promotes free choice, individual liberty, cultural freedom, and the open exchange of ideas. In the wake of COVID-19 school closures, Blaise has jointly published a policy paper entitled Pain Without Gain, Why School Closures Are Bad Policy. How are you today, Blaise?
I'm well, thanks, Colin. Thanks for having me.
All right, so perhaps you could paint a picture on how COVID-19 has affected learning and education in Australia.
Well, the first thing to understand about Australia is that it's a federalist system. So it's made up of states and territories, and the states and territories run their own school systems. So in that sense, the federal government doesn't have that much power over exactly what happens. So what we've seen is that some states have closed schools for long periods of time, for several months, and tried to have students learning at home during those periods. Whereas other states have barely closed their schools at all, maybe for 1 week. And that's largely because the medical advice, the expert medical advice given to governments in Australia has been that it's safe for schools to remain open. So that's basically what's happened. And our recent research just shows that there's evidence that students, especially from disadvantaged backgrounds, are hurt or don't learn as much during learning from home as they do in normal face-to-face classes. So that's quite concerning.
Right. So are there actually concerns about the efficacy of online learning? What are some of the outcomes that might have been modified in the wake of COVID-19?
Yeah, I think with online learning, there's pros and cons, right? So I think, there's benefits and costs. But I think in particular for students from disadvantaged backgrounds, online learning doesn't work very well. That's because they have less access to effective parental support at home. They probably have less access to reliable and fast internet at home, and less access to good educational resources. And so as a result, that policy tends to exacerbate existing inequities. So while for many students who are well motivated, there might be no effect, or there might even be a benefit of learning from home instead of being in a physical school, the truth is for a significant portion of Australian students, you have them, negatively affected by school closures. And I think that's been the real policy debate here over this issue.
Right. So as you've mentioned earlier, and also as is found in your recent policy paper, you stress on how school closures were not evidence-based. That is to say that schools decided to shutter primarily out of precaution, and in the case of Queensland, to actually send a message of the severity of the situation to the public. So I'm wondering, what are the grounds that might justify territory or even nationwide school closures?
Well, I think if there's expert medical advice, if the best possible evidence indicates that schools aren't safe to remain open, that if, for example, it's a disease which is easily transmitted from students to teachers or between students, then I think you can mount a convincing case for school closures. What we know, at least from the Australian evidence so far, is that actually with coronavirus, with COVID-19, students are less likely to get it. When they do get it, the transmission rate in schools has been extraordinarily low, and there hasn't been one case yet of a student infecting a staff member in Australia. So from that perspective, when we look at it, I think just clearly in Australia, the evidence anyway, the medical evidence shows that it's safe for schools to remain open. Now, that might differ depending on countries. Obviously, it's important that governments follow their localised expert medical advice to the best extent that they can. But in Australia, we have seen that some state governments have simply ignored that advice. And for example, in the case of Queensland, as you've mentioned, essentially they closed schools to send a message that this is serious, that coronavirus is serious. Now, I think that does raise a lot of concerns about what the role of government is and whether that's actually overstepping the mark, because it's basically using schools as a tool to send a message to the population rather than their primary purpose, which is to educate students.
Right. So as many parents would know, remote learning is heavily reliant on parental supervision and internet access. And as you've also mentioned just now, students from disadvantaged backgrounds may not have the necessary support, and they risk falling behind academically. So I'm wondering, in this pandemic, does it exacerbate the inequalities between students with highly educated parents and those without?
I think it does. I think it certainly does. I think another thing to remember here is that depending on the job background, it can be relatively easy for some parents to work from home, such as corporate office workers or public servants or whatever. And on the other hand, it's very hard for other workers to work from home, whether they be tradespersons or people who work in public transport or things like that. So it does depend a lot on the profession. At the same time, I think for all parents, whether they're from disadvantaged backgrounds or not, it is a bit unreasonable to expect them to both work from home and also supervise their child's education simultaneously. Like, that is a very hard thing to do. And there's been a lot of complaints about that. And I think it's fair to say that's an unreasonable expectation on the part of government. Because normally school closures go hand in hand with encouraging people to work from home, right? But I think it is unreasonable, it's impractical to expect people to work from home and do a good job of supervising their child's education at the same time.
Right. So what are some of the knock-on economic effects we can see from, or we can expect rather, from this disruption in education?
Well, I think there's been some estimates, for example, from the Australian Treasury, which indicate that 300,000 jobs have lost or at risk from 6 months of school closures. So that's just modelling based on the lower economic activity as a result of school closures. So that's in the short term, and that can be quite concerning. Obviously, it's hard to estimate. It's hard to know exactly how many jobs or what percentage of GDP growth has been lost due to school closures as opposed to other policies and restrictions in order to mitigate the effects of COVID-19. So it's a difficult question to answer. But I think going forward, though, if it does have a negative impact on students, and that isn't rectified over the next couple of years, then that does cause long-term educational damage, and that obviously in turn hurts the economy in the long term if you have more students who leave school without the essential skills they need to participate in the economy and in society.
So are there efforts by Australian tertiary institutions to help with this year's graduating class?
Yeah, there is. Some universities, for example, have said that they're not going to have admissions based on year 12 or the final year results. They're going to be based on earlier results from school. The way it tends to work in Australia is we have one rank called the Australian Tertiary Admissions Ranking, and the ATAR. And essentially that just ranks students based on their year 12 results by each state and territory, so their last year of school. And that generally works quite well because it means that the admissions process to university is transparent, it's clear, it's based on a formula which applies to everyone, and it's based entirely on academics. So we can sort of say it's reliable in that sense. It is difficult in this situation because a lot of students have been disadvantaged in their final year of school in the lead up to their final exams. And so that has impacted a lot of students. Although it has put everyone in the same boat, and because it's based on a ranking, in that sense, everyone's kind of equally affected up to a point. So I think it is possible to go ahead with that, and different universities are managing that in different ways.
Right. And moving forward, do you see this permanently changing how admissions are for universities? Like, do you think they will look at the years before year 12 when it comes to considering admissions?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Colin. I'm actually not sure of the answer. I think you could argue either way. I mean, from my perspective, I think that would be quite concerning because I think at the end of the day, you want all students to be on an equal playing field, to all have been assessed using the same assessments so that there's sort of a rigorous, fair, consistent approach to ranking students before they enter university. Because for lots of university courses, obviously there's far more demand than there is supply. So there's a huge number of students wanting to get into those university courses like medicine, for example, or law, and they're very competitive. And those admissions should continue to be based on a consistent approach rather than picking and choosing depending on what years or depending on co-curricular or extracurricular activities, which are obviously far less rigorous and far less consistent and fair measure of student achievement. So it'll be interesting to see going forward, but I personally can't see any clear, fair alternative to just using year 12 results to determine university admissions.
So looking at schools in general, from preschools to universities, we're seeing a massive adoption of technology more than ever. And comparing it to before the pandemic, where technology served a complementary role in education, do you see it taking up a more dominant role in a post-pandemic future?
It's hard to see. I mean, all the education evidence to date indicates that technology can be an effective supplement to normal face-to-face teaching, but it doesn't replace it very well. So in other words, it's good, it's a complementary, it sort of works well on the side to sort of improve student engagement and learning in some particular tasks. But in general, it just doesn't work as a replacement. And so if there is a trend towards using it as a replacement to normal schools, I think that is a bit concerning because that would indicate that students would be learning less in the long term.
So then, would you argue that every future dollar spent on digitalizing education would actually translate to a more efficient and effective means of learning? Will it make education pandemic proof, so to speak?
Well, I think it depends. If it's invested in good platforms, in good learning, effective learning platforms, which work well and allow teachers to teach in a more or less face-to-face way and be able to supervise student work to ensure they're on task and behaving and so on, then I think that can definitely add value. But I think investing in education technology simply for the sake of it doesn't work. We've seen a lot of wasting in Australia and also around the world of money spent on education technology. So I think that is something we do need to sort of keep in mind. That yes, all else being equal, better education technology in the long term helps us to be better prepared for situations like this unprecedented one. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that every investment is worthwhile. It really needs to go on a case-by-case, evidence-based basis.
So as of this airing, most schools in Australia would have reopened by now. Isn't there a race to make up for lost curriculum time? And if so, does it speak to the ineffectiveness of the home-based learning approach?
Yeah, I think there is, yeah. So based on our estimates, we think that disadvantaged students in Australia could be about between 2 and 3 weeks behind in numeracy and about 1 and 2 weeks behind in literacy on top of their existing gaps as a result of these school closures. So that's, that is something which needs to be addressed. It's not a catastrophic loss of learning. It's certainly not irretrievable because there was a lot of political and public pressure, especially from parents, to reopen the schools. And so for that reason, the school closures weren't as long as originally anticipated. So that's a good thing. But nevertheless, there is a gap there which needs to be made up. And so I think my argument would be schools really do need to focus in on those core curriculum areas, especially around literacy and numeracy, to ensure that students who have fallen behind in those areas catch up to their peers as soon as possible. Because there's a lot of evidence, Colin, that once you fall behind in those key areas of literacy and numeracy, that compounds over time and it affects other subject areas as well. So you really want to close that gap as soon as possible.
So would you argue that every dollar that's spent in the early years would actually really translate to savings in the later years in terms of like how much tuition or how much catch-up academic help they might need?
I think that's absolutely right. Yeah, I think that's where you can get the best bang for your buck in education investment. There's a well-known phenomenon in education known as the Matthew effect, which is that relatively small differences in ability in the early years of school grow into much larger differences by the end of school and by university, unless they're rectified early on. And it's a lot easier and a lot more efficient to rectify those gaps early on than later on when they're years behind their peers. So yeah, I think that's a really key point there. And a large part of that has to be assessment, right? We need to be able to assess where students are in those early years, track how they're going, track their progress, and if they have fallen behind, to intervene and ensure they catch up to their peers as soon as possible.
So going back to the policy paper again, one statistic that really jumps out at me is the fact that with the digital education revolution, Australian schools have actually the most digital devices per student in the world. But as you've also noted, Australia lacked, quote, a coordinated rollout of online teaching resources, unquote. So how might these resources be better used in a post-pandemic future? Would you argue like there should be more, there should be proper infrastructure to how these can be dispensed and how they should be uniformly applied across various schools?
Yeah, I think that's right. Infrastructure is very important. I'd say the most important thing, though, is teacher training, to really ensure that teachers are well trained and well equipped to be able to use that technology in an efficient and effective way. Because at the end of the day, the technology can be amazing. You can have tons of computers and laptops or screens or tablets for every student and every teacher. But if the teachers haven't been taught how to use that in an effective way as a supplement to normal face-to-face teaching, then it's really for nothing. The technology is only as good as the teaching which is associated with it. And so that would be my main point is going forward. If we want to make that investment gain greater returns, teachers need to be better trained and better equipped to be able to use that technology.
So also with the ongoing pandemic, UNESCO has actually called for ministries of education around the world to adapt their crisis-sensitive educational planning. what are some of the top considerations for the delivery of education in future crises?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think one thing is to ensure there's a good platform and there's an equitable access for all students. There's a plan in place to ensure that disadvantaged students can get decent external learning when schools are shut. I think also that there has to be some sort of way, I think, for in future pandemics for schools to be very healthy and very hygienic while also being open. So that might involve having more space per student in schools, ensuring that teachers are well trained to be able to deal with things like hygiene and hand sanitizer, possibility of temperature checks and those sorts of things. So just having the physical infrastructure in place to make schools safe, even in the midst of a pandemic. We've been quite lucky with this current virus because it appears that students are far less likely to get it. And when they do get it, they're far less likely to spread it to others compared to adults. So in that sense, COVID-19 is sort of a good example of where it's not a massive disaster for schools. But going forward, I think it's important that we do have those sort of processes in place so that schools can remain open even in the midst of a pandemic like this. Because the alternative is you have lots of students losing out on a significant amount of learning every time you have a situation like this. And we don't want that. We want to be able for students to keep learning at a normal rate, even when you're going through something like this.
Are there any early lessons that were learned from how the government and how schools sort of reacted to the situation?
Yeah, I think I suppose it's still early days, and at the same time, it's hard to be judgmental of any school or any school system at the moment because obviously it was a very difficult time and it's unprecedented, so it's hard to make decisions. But I think firstly, I think they were too quick to close schools before waiting for the evidence to see if it was actually worthwhile closing. And as it turns out in Australia, there was no medical benefit of closing schools. I think also there needs to be more consideration of what exactly are the impacts of closing schools. And in particular, it should be obvious to all policymakers that if you do close schools, disadvantaged students are the ones who suffer the most as a result. And I think that needs to be taken into account going forward as well. So I think just overall a better weighing up of the costs and benefits of different approaches in response to pandemics like this would be beneficial going forward.
So finally here, will we see more blended learning and strategic relationships formed with online program management or like online systems? Will we see schools sort of investing in more robust online learning programs? Do you perhaps foresee home-based learning days in the future?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think what certainly will happen is I think schools will have a backup plan. I think schools will have better backup plans going forward, and part of that will be investing in the education technology infrastructure to ensure that they can do that as a backup plan in case they do have to close schools going forward. So I think that's definitely going to be part of it. To be honest, I can't see in the long term schools not being around. I can't see not having face-to-face teaching because that human interaction, that face-to-face interaction is really important for students. So we know that's quite beneficial. The evidence from overseas, for example, in the US shows that online schools perform much worse than normal schools, especially for disadvantaged students, even after you take into account socioeconomic background and so on. It's just, in general, face-to-face learning is more effective. So yes, I think education technology will grow going forward. It'll be, I think, better, and I think it'll be an important supplement to face-to-face teaching, but I can't see it replacing normal schools anytime in the near future.
Blaise Joseph, it has been a pleasure. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Colin. Thank you.
This has been the Governance and Policy Podcast brought to you by the Adam Smith Centre, Singapore.